One of the biggest factors and biggest controversies in this year's election campaign is a huge influx in spending by outside groups. It's the result of a major Supreme Court ruling earlier this year that ruled unconstitutional the previous limits on such spending. In a moment, we'll debate whether that's a good or a bad idea and the impact. But first, let's break down some numbers on campaign spending. It's worth noting that most Americans don't give any money to political campaigns. $200 or more in contributions this year, 0.21%. Less than 1% of Americans have given even $200 or a little bit more to campaigns. Of course, some people have given more than $2,300, but it is such a small number, it is statistically insignificant. Worth remembering as we continue the conversation. Let's take a closer look at ad spending so far in this campaign. This is as of today. Outside groups, TV ad spending, more than $113 million. The Republican and the Democratic parties combined, about $825 million. Now, that's of today. This number is on reports filed as of June, so we know it's gone way up. But these are federal candidates running for the House and the Senate, $641 million as of June. So, of course, that number has jumped up quite a bit as we await the latest reports. Now, let's take a look at one race where outside money came in, and you decide whether or not it makes an impact. Let me pop it back up here. This is the Alaska Senate race. Our Country Deserves Better PAC, which is the Tea Party Express, gave a lot of money to Joe Miller, the candidate in Alaska. The money started coming in back in July, $550,000 total for Joe Miller. Did it have an impact? Well, let's take a look. When the money started coming in, Lisa Murkowski, the incumbent senator, was leading 62 to 30%. The money flowed in. On primary day, Joe Miller won that race 51-49. Pretty easy to make the case there that outside spending helped his campaign because it dwarfed his other spending. Now, with me now to have this debate, Tim Phillips. He's the president of Americans for Prosperity, one of the groups taking advantage of those rules, and Bill Allison, editorial director of the Sunlight Foundation, who doesn't like them. Simple question off the top. We have seen the impact of this money. Why is it a bad idea? The court says let it in.
I think, well, one of the biggest problems is we don't know where the money is coming from. If you go back to 2004, 2006, 2008, Public Citizen just released a report saying that we knew where more than half, upwards of 90% of the money was coming from for these independent ads. Now we're down to 32% that we're aware of, and as the spending continues to come in, you have all kinds of ads run by all kinds of different groups for all kinds of different reasons without the voters being able to determine who is behind the ad. And I think that's a really important thing to establish, is that where the money is anonymous, you can't tell who's paying for the ads.
Is that not a fair point? Should the American people have the right to know? The court says you can spend all you want. Should the American people have a right to know who's trying to influence my vote for Senate, my vote for Congress? Where's all this money coming from?
On the left, the public employee unions like SEIU, AFSCME, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars. They don't disclose their donors. They don't have to. On the free market side, I think it's a good thing to protect the privacy of individual Americans. We've seen too often individual Americans be targeted by the politicians. The chairman of our foundation, the Kochs, David Koch, he was attacked personally by the Obama administration, talking about his tax records. How outrageous is that? How chilling is that? I think it's good for Americans to have privacy. And if you want to know who Americans for Prosperity is, you can come to any of our rallies, events.
How would you answer that if I disclosed that I had given $10, $50, $100 million to this campaign, that my opponents would try to destroy my business or destroy me?
Well, I mean, I think that, if you look historically, there are some reasons why there has been anonymous giving, but generally speaking, it hasn't been around political campaigns. I mean, back in the turn of the century, the NAACP, the ACLU were unpopular organizations that took unpopular stands, but they weren't trying to influence federal elections. And I think that's the distinction that, ever since the Federal Election Campaign Act was passed. In 1972, for example, we had IT&T, which is a major corporation, offering to underwrite the Republican National Convention in exchange for getting an antitrust case that the Justice Department had filed against them dropped. That's why we need this kind of information about money in politics. Most of these folks who are giving to influence federal policy. The public that is governed by that federal government has a right to know who's trying to influence that policy. We disclose lobbying records, we disclose contributions to individual candidates, and just because somebody is better heeled or has more money to say that we don't have to disclose their identity, that really strikes me as like a two-class system.
The Supreme Court case was called Citizens United. In the Congress, there was an effort through what they called the Disclose Act to get at this, and they simply couldn't get the votes. They couldn't pass it. Is there a middle ground between you two, or is this no, you say no disclosure, and you say there has to be all disclosure?
Well, here's an important point. I know at Americans for Prosperity, the money we're spending this year, we're a C4. We don't advocate the election or defeat, so the Citizens United case doesn't impact us at all with our efforts. I think that if you're doing what we're doing, which is simply educating folks on the issues and where these candidates stand on health care and cap and trade, That's a good thing. If you want to go endorse candidates, then you can have a different discussion. But
let me be clear. I don't mean to interrupt, but let me be clear. You say you don't advocate election or defeat, but forgive me. Some of these ads are pretty tough, and it's pretty clear when you say, call Congressman John King and tell him you don't like, after 30 seconds of saying, you know, he's the most horrible guy who's ever lived.
We don't say he's the most horrible guy. We simply say he voted for the health care takeover. He voted for cap and trade, some of these left-wing congressmen and women. And that's a good thing. It's discussing the issues. We make a point, if you look at every one of our ads, of not making personal attacks. We don't do that. And by the way, I think you would have a C4 concern or issue if you did go that far.
From your position, do you see any hope in the sense that we don't know what's going to happen on November 2nd, but we're pretty clear that we are going to get a more Republican House and a more Republican Senate, and most, not all, most of the opposition to the Disclose Act came from the Republican Party. So are we in this, are we locked now in this new terrain, whether you like it or not, for 2012 and beyond?
That's the frightening thing. I mean, the Disclose Act did not pass. Is unlikely to before the election. Even if it were, the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, which is responsible for reporting this information, would not be up and running to do it. And yeah, there's a real possibility we'll flow into 2012 where there's a whole lot more money than there will be in the midterms, with all kinds of groups running all kinds of ads. And if you think about presidential politics, whether it's the Daisy ad from the Barry Goldwater, the Lyndon Johnson campaign ran against Barry Goldwater, all the way up through Michael Dukakis and Willie Horton, John Kerry and the Swift Boat vets. I mean, a negative ad can really define a candidate, and not to know who's paying for it or who's behind it really diminishes the ability of voters to assess that ad and to understand that ad and to understand the people behind that ad who are sponsoring it.
Major debate in the campaign. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time today. We'll continue the conversation because the debate won't end. I suspect it will carry on into the next campaign. And when we come back, we'll talk to our new 8 o'clock host, Elliot Spitzer and Kathleen Parker, about the president's strategy. Some Democrats think it's not working. And later in the program, Christine O'Donnell out live this hour. We'll talk about that and more with Bill Maher.